If you are worried you have Lyme disease, or just like the outdoors, and want the peace of mind of knowing whether you have Lyme disease or not, there is a new Lyme screening test based on decades of research by Dr. Richard Marconi, a professor at VCU Medical Center. For more information, visit glymedx.com, that's glymedx.com, or email at info@glymedx.com.
Infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to today's podcast. Today we're going to look at some common ectoparasites, lice. Now, according to the CDC, lice are parasitic insects that can be found on people's heads and bodies, including the pubic area. Human lice survive by feeding on human blood. Lice found on each area of the body are different from each other. The three types of lice that live on humans are head, body, and pubic louse. Now, today's topic is going to be head and body lice, and we'll be joined by parasitology expert Rosemary Drisdelle to discuss it. Hey, Rosemary, and welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Rosemary, can you first, before we get started into the details, can you just give a short summary on lice infestations?
Yes, lice live, as you said, on our heads, our bodies, and on our pubic hair, and it's a different type of lice in each one of those places, although the head and the body lice are very, very similar, and some would even argue that they're subspecies of the same species. They feed on blood, and they don't tend to live right on the skin, but instead they cling to either the hair or the clothing near the skin. So we're a little bit too hot for them. They like it just a little bit cooler. So they don't live right on us, but very close to us. And they don't survive very long off of their human host. So if they get removed, they get cold and miserable, and they have nothing to eat, and they die quite quickly.
So what are the head lice?
Head lice are insects, as you said. They look a bit, I would say, like a wingless wasp. They sort of have that head, body, and thorax body construction that we're so used to seeing in insects. They have little claws on the ends of their legs, which make it possible for them to cling to our hairs.
Now, where on the body specifically are head lice found?
They're found on the hair on the head, but as I said, not right on the skin, so they tend to be close to the skin, but not right on the skin and clinging to the hairs. They don't jump or fly, they crawl, and they actually move quite slowly. They're not very active insects.
Now, head lice are found worldwide. Here in North America, who's most at risk for head lice?
The group that we tend to see head lice in most commonly is children between the ages of about 3 and 11. And this is probably because children, they get close to each other when they're playing and when they're talking to each other. They tend to put their heads close together, so it's easy even for a slow-moving louse to move from one head to another. Other groups that we see lice infestations in are, of course, people who are not well off economically, who may be homeless or living in shelters, living close together without access necessarily to the laundry facilities and the hygiene facilities that the rest of us have.
Now, Rosemary, can you describe the different forms or different stages of head lice as far as appearance, etc.?
Yes. Lice lay eggs, and they actually cement those eggs onto the side of the hair, very close to the scalp. And these eggs just look like little bubbles almost on the hair. They're very, very tiny. They're perhaps a millimeter, and they have a little, if you look at them microscopically, they have a little trap door, what we call an operculum, through which the nymph, or the youngest stage of the louse, will emerge. Adults and nymphs look very similar to each other. It's just mostly a difference in size. So the adults are much easier to see. Even an adult head louse is still pretty small, perhaps only about 3 millimeters at the most, so you can imagine it would be quite difficult to spot a nymph, but it would still have approximately the same body shape as the adult.
Now, what are the signs and symptoms of head lice infestation?
You may not know that you have them at all until you have quite a few of them. They do feed on blood, as we said, so they tend to cause some itching. And we see sometimes with a really, really heavy infestation, you'll kind of get a lot of irritation of the skin and oozing, so matting of the hair. And underneath that matting, sometimes you can find a large number of lice. But that would be quite an unusual presentation. So usually to find lice, you would sort of look, we call it nitpicking, right? Mm-hmm. Looking through the hair, looking very carefully to see if you can spot those eggs and the lice clinging to the hairs there. So really, it really is a visual thing.
And typically, how do people contract head lice?
From close contact with somebody else. I know it's popularly believed that head lice are often spread through combs and hats and scarves, that kind of thing. But as I said, they don't survive very long off the human host. So within 24 to 48 hours, the hat of someone who has head lice is probably not a concern any longer. They die quite quickly.
And can you talk about the diagnosis and the treatment of head lice?
Yeah, diagnosis, as I said, is visual recognition and identification of either the nits cemented to the hair or the adult, usually. We don't very often see the nymphal stage, probably because they're so tiny and they tend to be very, very close to the scalp. The nits, our hair grows at the speed of about 1 centimeter a month. So the nits will move further and further from the scalp as the hair grows. They never basically fall off, so they can become a little easier to see. And you can estimate how long that louse infestation has been going on by the distance of the nits from the scalp, interestingly. There was a second part to your question, which I've now forgotten. Oh, treatment.
Treatment, yes.
Yep, there's a long list of drugs which can be used, and they're basically all insecticides. Many of them have some serious side effects if you have too much exposure, and some of them we find the lice are becoming resistant to, so it's a good thing there are some choices. You might need to try more than one. But things like permethrin, ivermectin lotion, and lindane, those are some common insecticidal drugs and preparations that people use.
Rosemary, do head lice spread disease?
They are not widely suspected of spreading disease. However, from the reading I've done, the message I've gotten is that although we tend to say that body lice spread disease, usually if you have infestations of body lice, you have head lice as well. So it's difficult to say that they don't, that they never do, but it certainly is the body lice that are more famous for doing so.
Right. Let's switch gears to the body lice. What are the body lice?
They look pretty much exactly like head lice, except they're a little bit bigger. And they're different in that they don't live on the body. They don't even live on the hairs of the body. Of course, we tend not to have a lot of body hair, but they live in the clothing. So you'll find them and their eggs in the creases of clothing. So perhaps next to the seam where they're stitching or any little places where they can hide. And then they visit the body perhaps 3 or 4 times a day to feed, but remain in the clothing.
Now, going back to the head lice versus the body lice, these are different, distinct genera and species, correct?
Well, you'll find a lot of debate about that in the literature. They're both pediculous, so it's Pediculus humanus capitis or Pediculus humanus corporis, if you follow the subspecies line of reasoning. And it seems to go back and forth every decade or so. We decide they are the same, they're not the same. The body louse almost certainly evolved from the head louse after people started wearing clothing. So if they are 2 distinctly different species, then they haven't been for very long.
Okay. So back to the body lice. Rosemary, what do the 3 forms or stages of body lice appear as?
Yes, as I said, the adult body louse looks very much like the head louse, so I described it before as being sort of like a wingless wasp. It has that sort of general body shape, although more flattened, I would say. The nymph looks the same as the adult, but is much smaller and tends to be more transparent, much difficult to see. And then the nymph would be the nit would be a similar egg with an operculum, but this time attached to clothing. So you'd find them in the seams. One thing I didn't mention was that the adult lice, there's a lot of sort of, I would say, folklore about how they appear. People talk about black lice and red lice and yellow lice. An unfed adult louse is usually a yellowish color, whereas if they've recently fed, they may be reddish, and if they have fed and now that blood is digesting inside their bodies, they tend to be more blackish. They also are sort of well known to camouflage themselves, so they appear darker in dark hair, and I'm not sure whether that's just a reflection of the light or whether they actually change color. I'm not sure.
Okay, Rosemary, where on the body do you find body louse?
You don't find them on the body. You find them in the clothing.
Okay. That's pretty straightforward. So they're not found in different parts of the hair of the body?
No, they tend not to be on the body, but in the clothing. Yeah. Okay. So of course they do very well where people don't have the opportunity to wash their clothing all that often. Right? Okay. Yeah.
All right. Now, what are the signs and symptoms of body lice?
Again, it would be itching, irritation of the skin, because they do bite and they do suck blood. Yeah.
So they're spread person to person?
Yes, that's right, through close contact, people who are living in close contact with each other, perhaps in shelters. You know, they're famous for infesting armies, people who are living and spending a lot of time in trenches and in army barracks and things like that. Yeah. And
is the diagnosis and treatment very similar to the head lice?
Very similar, yes. Again, it would be insecticides, and the trick is to use enough insecticide to kill the lice without harming the person.
Okay, excellent. Now, you mentioned earlier that body lice, it's pretty well known that they transmit disease. What kind of disease do they transmit?
They transmit several bacterial diseases, among them epidemic typhus, trench fever, and louse-borne relapsing fever. And again, these are more commonly seen in times of war. So one author that I read mentioned that to blame the louse isn't really fair, because we create the conditions in which they flourish with our wars and our poverty and that kind of thing.
Well, that really kind of leads into the last question, of course, is what we always do is I ask you about an interesting story. Rosemary, any interesting stories about head and or the body lice?
Well, my favorite louse story would have to be Thomas Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1170 during the reign of King Henry II. Now, at this time, of course, even people like Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, didn't tend to wash their clothing and shower and wash themselves as much as we do now. And in the wintertime, they tended to wear many layers of clothing in order to stay warm. So when you have many layers of clothing and you don't wash your clothing very often, it creates an ideal habitat for body lice. Thomas Becket, he kind of fell out of favor with King Henry. He wasn't doing what King Henry II wanted him to do. So a group of knights got together and decided that they would assassinate him, which they did inside the cathedral in Canterbury. And the Archbishop's body lay there in the cathedral overnight, and nobody came to retrieve the body and treat it respectfully until the following morning, by which time his body lice had all gotten cold and decided it was time for a grand exodus. So, and this is well documented, that if someone dies, their body lice will leave and try and find another warm body to live on. So it's actually documented in their literature that his body lice were leaving in armies. They were described as boiling over like water in a simmering cauldron. And he had that many body lice, and at that time this wouldn't have been at all unusual. So even back then there were occupational hazards, And this was one of the occupational hazards of people who prepared deceased people for burial, or grave robbers as well. They could pick up a few body lice in the performance of their duties.
Boiling over. Boy, that sounds so dramatic.
It's quite noticeable, I gather. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you once again, Rosemary Drisdelle, for your time and your expertise. Thank you, ma'am.
My pleasure.